What's going on, family? I'm Scrapbook Boxing, Museum of the Forgotten Fisticuffs series. I want to continue to examine 100 years of the greatest 150 black fighters of all times. Joseph Gans. He was known as Old Master. Many of you know him as Joe Gans. He was born November 25th, 1874 in Baltimore, Maryland. He weighed 133 pounds, and he stood 5'6¼ inches. Now, Joe Gans was the first black American lightweight champion of the world. And Joe Gans is underrated. Now, there are many books written on Joe Gans. There are discussions of Joe Gans. But I don't think many understand how underrated he really is because of the kind of fighter he was. He was an outstanding fighter, in a nutshell. And there's always been discussions as to who might have been the better lightweight champion. Would it have been Benny Leonard or Joe Gans? Because those are the only two you can match together. Everyone else is beneath these guys in terms of what they have gone through, the quality of opposition, and their careers, basically. So when you look at Benny Leonard went through a different set of circumstances than what Joe Gans had to deal with and go through. I'll explain. Benny Leonard was a Jewish fighter. Parents were immigrants. They would live on the Lower East Side. Now, Jewish fighters, a lot of them had to change their names because they were not accepted. And they came up in poverty. It was tough during those years. And Benny Leonard's dad was a shoemaker. He worked odd hours. And Benny Leonard wanted to help out his family. Mother didn't want him to box. Benny Leonard would go out and box, come back a little busted up, but he had money in his pocket. And his mother was upset with him and told him to wait till his father comes home. And she explained to the father what Benny has gone through. And when Benny's father approached Benny Leonard, wanted to know why did he fight and so on and so forth. And when Benny showed him the money, he asked his son Benny Leonard, his father did, when are you going to fight again? It was that tough during those years. But when you look at Joe Gans, completely different set of circumstances for him as a black man living in Baltimore in the South. In the time in which he came. That's why I always say, when I look at these criteria, I break down the criteria within itself. You got to look at the time in which a man came, what he had to go through, what he was denied opportunities to. In the case of Joe Gans, he had to take several dives. And I emphasize the word had to. He didn't have a choice during the time in which he came. Benny Leonard was a little different. He didn't have to deal with those kinds of things. Joe Gans had to. But all in all, Joe Gans still succeeded during his time. He discovered the jab and he discovered the 1-2 combination punch. And he maximized his skill set. No one could jab like Joe Gans. And Jack Blackburn, who would face Joe Gans several times. He was in a ring with Sam Langford 6 times. But Joe Gans would state that the only way to jab is through timing and rhythm. That's how you be successful with the jab. So Jack Blackburn would explain that to Joe Louis later on in life. And Jack Blackburn would explain how he learned how to jab. And it was through Joe Gans. Joe Gans would take Jack Blackburn on a back porch where he would have a slab of meat hanging. And it was to attract flies. Now, when the flies came, he had Jack Blackburn try and catch flies. Blackburn couldn't do it. And Joe Gans would laugh. And Joe Gans would do it. Catch him every time. In fact, he would catch 2 or 3 at the same time in many cases. He would catch one, and then midair he would shift his arm over, and he would catch another one, and in midair he shifted over and catch another one. Because he understood the technique, he understood the timing of catching flies. So he knew how to jab. And so Jack Blackburn would take that skill set and explanation to Joe Louis later in life. Sam Langford learned how to jab. He had a different approach to his jab. But all that came from Joe Gans. So Joe Gans had discovered a lot of ways to offset his opponent. Joe Gans could body punch as well. But Joe Gans would begin boxing in 1891. Now, the first fighter they have on record is Dave Armstrong. Fought him in Baltimore, knocked him out in 12 rounds. In fact, Joe Gans would have 9 consistent knockouts, consecutive knockouts. Some would be in the 12th round, some would be in the 22nd round, some would be in the 11th, the 12th, the 10th, the 2nd. And he would be consistent with his knockout. Now, I mentioned to you there were times where he had to do what he had to do. He had to play ball. Didn't necessarily take a dive, but he would carry his opponent in certain states. So in 1895, he would take on fighters such as Soul English. Fought him in Baltimore, March 7th, 1895 to be exact. And he would defeat him in 10 rounds. Soul English was a farmer. He was raised on a farm. And he kind of had things going his way. He was not to be knocked out. Joe Gans understood that. But then you had a fighter by the name of Kentucky Rosebud. You heard me talk about him plenty of times. Would fight him back to back April 2nd and April 25th of 1895. And he would defeat him in 7 and 6 rounds. Kentucky Rosebud was a very, very good fighter. And that's why he's on this list as well. If you go back to previous videos, you'll see that. But Joe Gans would also take on young Griffo, November 18th, 1895. Fought him in Baltimore, and he would have a 10-round draw with young Griffo. In 1896, he would take on fighters such as Howard Wilson. 8 rounds. January 28th, 1896 to be exact. And he would fight him in Baltimore. And he would have several fights that year. He would even take on Dale Hawkins. Dale Hawkins would become a champion. October 6th, 1896 is when he would face Dale Hawkins. And he would lose to him in 15 rounds. And Dale Hawkins was a decent fighter during his time. As I mentioned to you, he was a champion. In 1897, Joe Gans would take on young Griffo once again, September 21st to be exact. He would fight him in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and he would go 15 rounds, and he would score it as a draw. He would take on Bobby Dobbs, September 27th, 1897. Bobby Dobbs is on this list. Fought him in Brooklyn, New York, and he would lose to him in 20 rounds. My point is, the fighters that Joe Gans would fight were fighters. They were fighters. And he didn't have it easy. Joe Gans had well over 200, possibly 300 fights. They have recorded 156 fights with 55 knockouts. He had more knockouts than that. I have other sources to justify that. And it's just unfortunate the time in which Joe Gans came, the ball was not always in his court. I mean, you're looking at men such as Spider Kelly and George McFadden. He was a very good fighter. Kid McPartlin, another good fighter, fought him in Chicago, December 22nd, 1899. It would be a 6-round draw. In 1900, February 9th, he would take on Spike Sullivan in New York, and he would defeat him in 14 rounds. Now, he would lose March 23rd, 1900, to a fighter by the name of Frank Earn, New York. He'd be stopped in 12 rounds. And that was for the World Lightweight Championship belt. Gans refused to continue. And he would suffer from that because during those years, when you didn't choose to continue, they called you a yellow streak. They called you a quitter. And Joe Gans was pressured not to continue. And he set out to prove a point after being called those names. So right after that, he would have consistent knockouts. Would knock out Chili Jack Davis. Would knock out Dale Hawkins. Would knock out Barney Fury. Would knock out Young Griffo. He would knock out Whitey Lester. He would knock out Dale Hawkins. But then they had to hold him back. Because they wanted to make sure that they had Joe Gans under control. Because if you left it up to him, he would knock all them guys out. Because he understood the science of boxing. He was a very underrated fighter. 1909, he would take on Bobby Dobbs twice. He would defeat him twice. And Bobby Dobbs was a hell of a fighter. He would defeat a lot of the guys moving forward with Bobby Dobbs. But once again, it's just unfortunate what Joe Gans had to go through. Now, May 12th, 1902, he would take on Frank Earn once again, and he would knock him out in one round. He would win the World Lightweight Championship of the world. He could have done that the first time. And he didn't continue. And they would call him a yellow streak. I just wanted to talk about Joe Gans. I personally have him the greatest lightweight champion of all times. And I have it for my own specific reason. He was a hell of a fighter. He was held back, had to take dives, couldn't be who he was in a ring. September 30th, 1904, he would take on Joe Walcott, the Barbados Demon. Fought him in San Francisco, California. 20-round draw. It would be for the World Welterweight Championship. Now, Sam Langford had that same problem with Walcott. 1904, he would have a 15-round draw. And in that case, it was a non-title fight. Wasn't taking any chances with Sam Langford. But Joe Gans would take on Sam Langford in 1903. December 8th. But Joe Gans would have a fight the evening before. He would fight Dave Holly in Philadelphia. He would have to travel 300 miles within 24 hours to Boston to take on Sam Langford. Now, Sam Langford, that was his first year as a professional. Now, he fought a few fights towards the end of 1902. But it was his first full year as a professional. And Sam Langford would get that shot with Joe Gans. The thing with the Sam Langford fight, Sam Langford came in overweight. So it became a non-title fight. They would still fight, and Sam Langford would defeat Joe Gans. But it was for a non-title fight. So Joe Gans would keep his title. Now, Joe Gans would die August 10th, 1910 in Baltimore, Maryland. He would suffer from tuberculosis. He was elected in the Boxing Hall of Fame in 1954. But I got news for you. Joe Gans was in there with Jimmy Britt. He was in there with Ruff Turner, another black fighter. Mike Sullivan. Mike Twin Sullivan. He was in there with Harry Hairpin Lewis. Battling Nelson. Kid Herman. Jimmy Britt. Now, Britt had claimed that he broke his wrist in the 4th round. It would go down as a 6th-round knockout in behalf of Joe Gans. But the biggest tragedy, July 4th of 1908, we stopped in 17 rounds by battling Nelson. And many knew he took a dive. Fought him again in a rematch. And he was KO'd again. The 21st round, September 9th of 1908. July 4th of 1908, he was KO'd in 17 rounds. And that would be just about it for Joe Gans. He, unfortunately, just couldn't be who he was. So you don't get the full story of Joe Gans. But if you have common sense and those who know their history and those who know of the situation and or circumstance, if they wanted to be honest to you about it, they know that Joe Gans couldn't be who he was. And it was because of who he was as why he couldn't be himself. Because of what he was, he couldn't be himself. So I just wanted to talk about Joe Gans. And I'm not using Joe Gans as a standard. Because if I did that, then half of these guys wouldn't be in there. But I'm just giving you an analysis of who a fighter is. And that's why as we move further in decades of the series, and you see the fighters of current, the opportunities they have, they're not fighting under the conditions of a Joe Gans or even a Benny Leonard for that matter. They get to pick and choose. Thanks to Floyd Mayweather setting those standards, which I am giving full credit to Floyd Mayweather because Floyd Mayweather is a product of Joe Gans. And Joe Gans and Ike Williams and Bo Jack and Bob Montgomery, Joe Brown, they all set standards for Floyd Mayweather and Pernell Whitaker. And if you want to go welterweight, Joe Gans didn't fight as a welterweight. The Barbados Demon Joe Walcott did. And Ray Robinson and Kit Gavilan. These fighters set standards for Mayweather to make the kind of money he's making. But look at the opportunities these men have. They're not even taking examples from Floyd Mayweather. So you can't compare any of those fighters to a Joe Gans because Joe Gans didn't have the opportunities, or Langford didn't have the opportunities that the fighters who are currently fighting today have. So you're going to see a lot of men not on that list who are fighting currently because they're not consistent. There's about 4 or 5 guys Curtis and I selected, black fighters who are fighting today that will be on the list. That's all. Because of the inconsistencies. So I just wanted to share the conversation of Joe Gans with you. He was something else, man. He did it all. He was in there with Jack Blackburn. He was in there with Sam Langford. He was in there with Ruff Turner. Was in there the Barbados Demon Joe Walcott, Dave Holly. I mean, Black Griffo, all of these guys. And I'm speaking of black fighters he faced. Or unbelievable fighters. They were the top names in their day. So shout out to Joe Gans. I have him listed as the greatest lightweight champion of all times. When you break down what he's gone through, the time in which he fought, what was dictated to him, he invented the 1-2 combination punch. Great fighter was Joe Gans. Let's take a look at Jack Johnson for one moment. Now, Jack Johnson was known as the Galveston Giant. Little Arthur, the Galveston Texan. He was born March 31st, 1878 in Galveston, Texas. Now, he weighed 195 pounds, up to 200 pounds. Stood 6 foot and a quarter inches. And he was managed by Morris Hart and George Little. Had several managers. But Jack Johnson was not a controlled fighter. Now, he started out that way. And he was fighting all the other black fighters in his time. He was in the ring with Joe Jeanette 10 times. And Jack Johnson understood the fighters he was in there with. Now, he was part of what we call the Black Wave, the first wave of Black Murderers Row. And before I even talk about Jack Johnson, the reason why this list that we're making, Curtis and I, is so tough, because the names that are on this list have to be on this list. You're looking at fellas like George Dixon, who created the shadow boxing. He was a 2-weight division champion. He was the first champion black fighter in any sport. He was the first champion of any nationality to defend his title overseas, to win the title overseas. He participated in a Carnival of Champions in 1892. July 6th to be exact. It was against Jack Skelly. Jack Skelly was an amateur star out of Brooklyn. And George Dixon would beat him half to death to the point where they would ban mixed race matches. From 1892 to 1952. And it would be Kid Gavilan and Bobby Dykes. There would be the first mixed race match in over 60 years. It was because of George Dixon and what he did to Jack Skelly. You had Joe Walcott, the Barbados Demon. He was the first black welterweight champion. The Black Prince, Peter Jackson, who was an Australian heavyweight and colored heavyweight champion. You had Frank Craig, the Harlem Coffee Cooler, young Peter Jackson. Tom Molyneux, who was the second American boxer. He was the second black fighter of America. The first one was Bill Richmond. He was the first fighter of America to fight for a championship with Tom Cribb in 1810. Yeah, Dixie Kid,